Hello, my name's Peter Marsden, and it is my honour and privilege to lead Concordis International. And it is my huge pleasure on Concordis' 20th birthday to be in conversation with Dr. Michael Schluter, who is many, many things to many, many people. But one part is that your writings, Michael, informed me long before you and I had a chance to meet for the first time. So when I was a young solicitor in training, reading your work on relational thinking and sort of relational proximity was informative of my career as a family solicitor. And then, of course, actually getting to know you when I joined the Concordis team 12 years ago. It's been a pleasure to work alongside. So it is brilliant to celebrate our 20th birthday by being in conversation in your
It's great to see you again, too. I must say it's a real joy.
Thank you, Michael. Michael, I'd love to, in our conversation, I'd love to take us back, please, to some of the sort of origins of Concordis, way before Concordis was ever a twinkling in your eye. And I think some of the thinking, the sort of international sort of manifestation of this work was when you started working in South Africa.
Yeah, that's right.
Tell us about how that all came about.
Well, it's a bit of a bizarre story, but then life's like that, isn't it? So it was 1986. I'd just been fighting Mrs. Thatcher on the issue of Sunday shopping in a very simplistic kind of way. It might sound a bit naive, but I thought to myself, look, if God is willing to intervene in British politics when people act in faith, isn't it possible that God might intervene in South Africa to bring an end to apartheid if people of faith try to bring an end to apartheid? So I discussed it with my brother-in-law, who was at that time member of the House of Lords, Lord Brentford, and my sister was all up for hostessing events and people coming together. And so I said, look, as you've got this lovely place in Sussex, supposing we invited a number of people from South Africa, from the different racial backgrounds, supposing we invited them to come together and just meet and talk about how they think it would be possible to bring an end to apartheid in South Africa. It sounds very sort of naive, but as you'd understand from the work you do, actually, in virtually every situation, simply getting a group of people with diverse points of view to come together and talk and look each other in the eye and realize they're not complete villains. These are actually human beings like me. And I remember getting them round the table at Newark Park, their home, over dinner, and getting them all to tell their stories. And you could see eyes popping out of heads as they heard about, what these, for example, the black Africans had gone through in order to get where they were, the kinds of difficulties they'd had to overcome, how they financed, how they even fed themselves. And clearly there was this huge failure to understand what we now call multiplexity, many-sidedness, understanding a person's background and context, huge gaps in the information and understanding of where these people are coming from each side. So that was kind of the beginning. So after a first meeting, we held another meeting, and then another meeting, and then the meetings moved to South Africa, and then we ran 10 meetings in South Africa, but we had less and less role. But then eventually it became clear that because the ANC were not allowed back into South Africa at that time, because the white government wouldn't let them in, all the leaders, we had to move the meetings back to Britain. Washington Akumu got on board, and he was a key link into the black African leadership, because it was hard for us as a white group to really penetrate into the black leadership and get them fully on board and participating. So he provided that key bridge. And so we started running the meetings here in Britain. And I remember we were in one meeting down in Reading when Mandela was released. It was the day that I think F.W. de Klerk actually, that said he would be released, and then we could see him on television walking out in Cape Town of prison after whatever it was, 27 years. So that provided the context in which we started off the work of what became the Newark Park Initiative. That's how it all began.
So, Michael, I mean, you I know, are an economist and former World Bank economist, and you know that of which you speak. At the same time, you're a white European speaking into these things.
Yes, yeah.
So whether or not it's right, these questions of land reform and delaying the transfer of power, of ownership, these are incredibly politically complex and vexing questions. So how do you, or did you, go about speaking into these things sensitively and in a way that some of those messages could come across?
So we ran these consultations and we got more and more the right people in the room. So we started off at what I would call second division level. We didn't get the real power brokers in the room initially. But then once they got comfortable, we asked them to suggest some of the people to whom they reported to come to our next consultation. So we gradually went up the ladder till we got the real players in the room. And that took, several years to go up that process. But the key to it was that we produced the research papers. So we said, how is it possible to resolve, for example, the ownership of the mines? What are the options here in terms of allowing greater participation by the black community in the ownership of these mines? Because it's vital mines are efficient, they produce all foreign exchange, they must go on operating effectively in global markets. They're the ones with the contacts overseas, like Oppenheimer with the gold and the platinum and all of that kind of thing. So how do you gradually get that transition to take place? So we were writing these research papers. I think we wrote 91 research papers for that South African work. But at a policy level, we're talking sort of track 2 here. You're talking about behind the scenes at a national level rather than a regional, local level, where the problems are different. And Concordis knows much more about that than I do. But at the national level, how do you get both sides to look at options that they might consider as feasible? So you write these research papers, you get high-level people on both sides who either are the key players or probably work with or close to the big players. You get them in the room and you say, okay, here's a way we think it could be done. Now you critique this and adjust it and develop it in a way that you think might work for your constituencies. So our original papers were not the important ones really, except that they were a start of a 10. You have to give them something to come to discuss. You can't bring them in a room and say, okay, how do we transfer the economy to black people? It's never going to work. All you get is a shouting match. So you give them a feasible proposition that they can look at, and then they will hack it around and decide. So it was really interesting that after, for example, our conference on the banks and the mines, there was a little article in the Financial Times which said, the ANC in its quarterly meetings of its membership decided this week that they were no longer going to pursue nationalization of the mines, that they were open to other possibilities, and they were exploring these different options. Now, that was a marker. The Financial Times had picked that up by being at an ANC meeting where these things were being discussed. They didn't, of course, mention where it all came from. We didn't mind about that. That wasn't the point. But there were clear markers in the media that this was starting to really have impact. So that was very exciting.
That's really, really exciting to have some of your writing, some of your research coming from the mouth of other people.
Yes.
And it being their idea.
Absolutely. That's the secret. Absolutely well put.
So, Michael, you've told us a bit about this. What do you really see as the impact of your work, I guess the legacy of your work in South Africa today, with all of its challenges, but also as a success story?
Well, I have a son in South Africa who's living and working there. And I don't think he would actually be able to do that if the foundations had not been laid by some process like this. I mean, if we hadn't done it, maybe somebody else would have succeeded in doing it. But unless there'd been a peaceful transition at the time of the independence of South Africa in April 1994, then you would have had such turmoil and such a lot of violence in South Africa that it wouldn't be a functioning democracy today. Now, we may critique that democracy. Obviously, it has weaknesses, like every democracy has, by the way, including our own, but it wouldn't be a functioning democratic state and a peaceful state, I think, unless that process had taken place, and I don't see how the whites would ever have been allowed to stay on and continue their effective role and contribution to running a modern economy in South Africa, because you couldn't simply shoehorn black people who've got no training in business and finance and so on into those senior positions. You couldn't do that. The economy would have collapsed, and with the economy collapsing, the employment would have collapsed. And with that, you would have had a recipe for mass violence. As you can see, in places like Bangladesh, you lose law and order and you've lost everything. So I think the legacy of that work really is to see a modern, functioning South African society today, which is increasingly moving to black ownership and black dominance, as it should do, and the whites playing a diminishing role.
So actually, I mean, one of the bits you've written about before is about proximity of power.
Yes.
And so actually by affording a level of power,
yes,
gives a greater proximity of power, I could imagine.
Well, I think it increases relational proximity, because relational proximity depends on 5 factors you may remember. Partly it's about communication, directness, continuity and multiplexity, as we call it. But it's partly about parity, that is mutual respect, and it's partly about shared goals. What has happened since then in South Africa hasn't worked out entirely satisfactorily, but it was a pretty impossible situation that the black government inherited. I mean, remember, you had 300 years of apartheid, and you don't put that right overnight with respect to the land ownership, for example, who owns the land, and how do you transfer the land? How do you train up a body of African farmers who have the necessary skills, not just to drive a tractor on those farms, but to look after the finances of the farm and make sure they produced a large amount of the food that was required by the urban areas? Because the difficulty is, if you transferred the land to the African community, who weren't really familiar with running big farms, and they didn't succeed, all the foreign exchange would then have to go to importing food, and that meant you couldn't import your industrial raw materials for your industrial sector. So then you'd have massive urban unemployment, and you get back to the whole political instability. You have to maintain the white farmers on the land for long enough for them to be able to train a new cohort of black farmers to run these huge farms.
I'd love to know, if it's not a cheeky question, what you learnt through that process of engagement with South African politics, and what would be the sort of the big lesson that you might pass on to us as Concordis on our 20th birthday?
Once you get into national policy, you really do, one of the lessons is you really do have to do the homework on the research of the policy. You can't avoid it if you're going to make real progress. So you need a research department. You need to commission papers from experts in the field, and you need to pretty tightly define what they're going to say in their papers. So before they agree to write them, you're going to get the outcome you need. So in a sense, you've got to envision where the answer lies. Now, that doesn't mean that you've put everything in detail into their papers. No, they've got to write their papers, but you've got to have a pretty good idea of where you're going to end up. So you do need to have a research capacity to do that, I think, if you're going to work at a national level, as in South Africa.
So fantastic. I love that. So if I could synthesize, you would say,
yes,
do your homework, really do your homework, do the research,
yep,
really understand the context.
Yes.
Be well versed in economics, because actually the maths is important. To help people to own it. So it's really important that you put in your contribution, but it's got to be there. They've got to own it. They've got to embrace it. And
absolutely.
Really, and then really think quite carefully about these questions of power and control. And to quote somebody else, it's the art of the possible. I'd love to ask you, Michael, if I may, about Rwanda.
Yes.
So how you've been doing all this amazing work in South Africa. How did you come? Well, of course, all of us saw the horrors unfold in 1994
yes.
in Rwanda. But how did you come to be involved there?
Well, it's a bit surreal, but this is the truth. So, and I got it documented in my study somewhere. So what happened was I had a dream, as one does. I don't actually have many dreams, and certainly don't have dreams that are sort of significant in this sort of way. But in my dream, in September 1993, I saw a Murram road. Do you know what I mean by a Murram road? It's a sort of red earth
Driven
road.
down many of them, yes.
Yes, absolutely. So it was clearly in Africa. And on this Murram road, it went up a very steep hill. And at the top of the hill, there was a roadblock. And there was a stream of people going up this Murram road to this roadblock. And then what was horrendous in this dream was that there were a group of men on the roadblock who were then hacking the people coming up the road to pieces with machetes. So literally just hacking them like this, cutting off their arms, their legs, everything. And what was most horrific about it was that they were laughing while they did it. It was a horrendous dream. I assumed when I'd had this dream in September 1993 that what I was seeing was huge violence in South Africa, and the picture was of a road in the Drakensberg where you've got these mountains in, where is it, south of South Africa, southeast of South Africa, where you have these very steep roads going up, and that this was a picture of the violence that was going to happen in South Africa if peace was not achieved. And I called my chairman and I said, look, I think we've got to re-engage in South Africa. We'd finished in 91. The formal talks had then started, the CODESA talks as they were called. So our role had kind of dropped out. So we'd stopped. We'd run out of money anyway. I think we ended up with £50,000 of debt, by the way. So we did re-engage in 93. And that was when Washington Akumu came in and helped bring Inkatha into the elections and stopped all the violence in the townships. And I might have thought, well, that was the end of the dream, and that was done. But actually, 3 days after the election in South Africa, there was a piece on the BBC, and I saw on the BBC upstairs in this house, I was sitting watching the television, and I saw exactly what I'd seen in the dream. It was exactly what it was, but it was the genocide going on in Rwanda.
Goodness.
Guys were going up these roads, there was a roadblock, and they're being hacked to pieces with people laughing. You know, the Hutus were killing the Tutsis in exactly that way. I mean, it was, you know, how you explain that on any normal Western rationalist assumptions and framework, I have no idea. But anyway, from my point of view, I believe that God was in some way speaking to me through this dream that I'd had, and that actually, although it was used by God perhaps to re-engage with the South African process, actually it was an indication that he was going to want me to engage with Rwanda. So that's how I got into Rwanda in the first place, very soon after the genocide. I started going to Rwanda, and I went and visited some of the places where huge numbers of people had been murdered. And there were then 152,000 people awaiting trial for murder. So the courts could only handle 1,000 a year. So how many years was it going to take to try all the people currently in prison? 152 years, right? How many of them would be alive 152 years later? Not all of them.
And the conditions were horrendous in the prisons as well.
Yes, I would think they were pretty bad. So what would be a feasible way to resolve this problem for the court system? And what we suggested to the Rwandan government was that they should set up a local court system, which came to be called the Gacaca courts. So the local community would come together, and they would try people from their communities who were being held in prison by the government to adjudge whether they were guilty or not guilty and what part they played in the genocide. So you had a number of categories. So you had people who clearly simply wanted to get out and murder the opposition, I mean the Hutus, or the Tutsis rather, in this case the Hutus would have been killing the Tutsis. But you had a lot of other complex situations. So, for example, supposing that a group of Hutu come to your door and they say, look, either you come and join us on the roadblock, to the man of the house, either you come and join us on the roadblock and hack these people to pieces like we are, or we're going to hack your wife and children to pieces in front of you here, now. So you come or you stay, that's up to you. But if you don't come, these are the consequences. Now, wind forward a year or two. Now, this guy was on the roadblock and he clearly committed violence. So how guilty is he of what he did when the way he was bullied into doing it was at the threat of his own wife and children? It's a difficult judgment to make, isn't it?
So obviously the whole justice system, trying to put together some kind of workable system of justice with all of these very complex issues of culpability, it's just unbelievably complex.
Yeah.
But you were saying that initially many of the Tutsi community found it difficult to engage with this process for very understandable reasons. Having come up with this idea of a kind of local system of justice, how did you manage to bring people together to accept some kind of justice that would be acceptable to Hutus and Tutsis, to those who'd been coerced into the violence or perhaps were in custody, and those who'd been victims of it, bearing in mind, of course, there are victims from all sides in this conflict. How did you go about doing that?
Well, I think the concept of these community courts, I think the biggest challenge initially was to get the government to accept that this was a good way to go about it. And we had two people who were very helpful for that within the government. One was a guy called Gerald Gahima, who was the Attorney General at that time, I think, or Minister of Justice. But he had come to our conferences and we had an opportunity to talk to him and influence his thinking. And I think he saw the obvious advantages of these local courts to achieve what he wanted to achieve, because the way it worked was that the local community would meet and would make a recommendation to the Ministry of Justice. So they would take this particular individual from their village, and there would be a discussion about what he'd done during the genocide, why he'd done it, had he participated, how he participated, and all of those kinds of things. And they would then make a recommendation as to what should happen to this person. Should he be simply released because actually he was quite innocent and he got the accusations against him did not hold water within the community. So that was one category. That was very nice and comfortable and easy. So that sort of diminished the number. The second category were those that they thought were clearly guilty. But there were extenuating circumstances, so they would like them to have a community punishment, that they would do 2 or 3 years work clearing the village or clearing new land or doing something which would atone for their wrongs. And then there were those who were clearly part of a brutal group who simply wanted to murder the other side, and they should go up for proper trial by the Ministry of Justice as soon as it could be arranged. So, but they managed to whittle down this 152,000 to a much, much smaller number, and yet deal with it in a way that the community felt completely satisfied with. And therefore, in a sense, the groundwork was laid for then the country to be able to move on and to move forward and get beyond the genocide. And as you know, Rwanda's been astonishingly successful as in their economy and their growth since that time.
So, Michael, I'd love to ask you, what was it that you felt you learnt through that whole sort of engagement with the horrors in Rwanda and the aftermath there? And what are the sort of lessons that we could embrace or take on as Concordis 20 plus 30 years later?
Well, 2 or 3 things come to mind. Let me tell you a story. We held a meeting about a year after the genocide finished. We were in Kigali and we held a meeting of the senior church leaders in Rwanda, because 96% of Rwandans are Christians and either Roman Catholic or Protestant, and it was a particular horror for me that a, quote, Christian country where most people go to church could engage in genocide. I mean, so we ran a meeting of the bishops, Anglican, Catholics, archbishops and bishops, in Kigali, and the person who was also in charge of the religious community, that is the Roman Catholic Protestant Interfaith Council in Kigali, who gave a talk, and we asked him to speak about forgiveness after genocide. And he gave a 40-minute talk, which was simply a rant, a Tutsi rant against the Hutus who had committed these murders. And that was his contribution to a conference which was meant to be about peace and reconciliation. So I was talking to an Anglican bishop over coffee at the end of it, and I said, I just don't see any hope for Rwanda if the head of the church's interfaith group in Kigali, when asked to speak about reconciliation, can simply give a rant against Hutus, the other ethnic group involved. And he looked at me and he said, Michael, what do you think you'd be saying here today if you'd seen your wife and your 5 children hacked to pieces by another ethnic group just a year ago? What would you be saying in this meeting today? Well, that was a wake-up call for me, because I realized then that I'd not really adequately engaged with the emotional trauma that all these people had been through and what exactly they'd experienced. I was coming in as a peace builder, lots of good intentions and everything like that, but emotionally, I'd not really connected with what they'd gone through and where they were in their lives at this point. Because the trauma of it all had been so awful. And of course, there was no counseling services you could go to or trauma counseling or anything like that. I mean, they were living with all of these awful things that had happened, and to their neighbors as well, by the way. And they were living with those things on a daily basis. And here were we charging in as these, clever Westerners, thinking that we could tell them about, peace and reconciliation and stuff without really understanding where they were coming from. So that was a big wake-up call for me. I thought, you arrogant Westerner, you arrogant Westerner, how can you behave like this?
So there's a real lesson learned for Concordis.
A real lesson learned there, and something that I hope Concordis will give serious attention to in all of its dealings in these conflict zones and the traumas that people have been through. But I'm sure you do it much more than I would anyway. But anyway, yes.
No, but thank you. And an absolute sort of clarion call for engaging with the intellectual, with the economic, and with emotional.
And I think also another lesson for me was it may sound negative, but the intractability of the relationship problem between Hutus and Tutsis. I mean, if you looked back in history, every 10 years, about 250,000 people had been murdered. It wasn't that this genocide came out of nowhere. There was a history of, 250,000 of Hutus or Tutsis killed, and then it happens again after 10 years, and then again after 10 years, and then you have the big one. And interestingly, in Burundi, the ethnic composition was the other way around. So whereas you had Hutus killing Tutsis in Rwanda, you had Tutsis killing Hutu in Burundi, just next door, on the same sort of scale, which obviously what was going on in Burundi was influencing what happened in Rwanda and vice versa. So this was a much bigger problem than I had initially understood. I was kind of managing or overseeing a process where I had extremely capable operatives on the ground who were engaging with the Rwandans on a day-to-day basis, setting up the conferences, setting up the meetings. When I went down there, everything was arranged for me. And I was then using my international connection. So in both the Rwanda situation, well, in the South African and the Rwanda, and then in the Sudan situation, I was actually part of a team. I would want to emphasize that. I was just fortunate to be part of a team. So, and each of them made important contributions. So I think that's a really important thing I'd want to emphasize in peace building. You need a variety of skills, contacts, and interests. You need the people who've got the wider international connections. Certainly, that was my role. But actually, you need the people who are in daily contact with the players and who are on the ground much more than I could ever be. because I was doing other things as well. So yeah, that's how it works.
I love you saying that. I mean, one of the reasons why it's a huge privilege to take on this role is that I get to be part of a team of 60 people who are peace builders, and then a network of about 500 local peace builders who are kind of living right where the conflict is fought and felt. And to be part of that team is an extraordinary thing. It's a real privilege.
It is a real great privilege, isn't it? Yeah,
it's really good. Oh, it's great to hear you say that.
Yeah,
Michael, I'd love to ask you about Sudan, because it's relevant again now. As Sudan, as you and I are speaking, Sudan's at war, and these kind of questions about marginalisation of certain areas is a live issue again. Yes. As you look back, as you look to Sudan, what are your thoughts? What are your feelings as you look at that country that we both love?
Well, obviously enormous sadness that longer term solutions and institutions could not be built which would have avoided the fighting that we've got now. And Darfur always seems to come up as a major issue. It's still a major issue even now, isn't it?
It is.
And you've got the agriculturalists and the pastoralists, and how you deal with their competing interests, and particularly those are around water. And that water, much of it is being channeled down from the Nile into Darfur. That's their major source of water, is my understanding and my recollection. So did we fail in our thinking to think adequately about the institutional environment and context and how you resolve those institutional questions? I remember Brendan Bromwich saying to me, the trouble is everybody wants a slice of that water. So all those forests that lie between the Nile and Darfur, those forestry areas are all wanting to use the water to be able to expand their forestry, which from a long-term environmental point of view would be very desirable. But at the same time, you've got the enormous pressure within Darfur to be able to use it both for the pastoralists and the agriculturalists. So how can you satisfy these competing demands? And the only way to satisfy them is to build the relationships between these different groups. But that's quite a considerable task. And who's the catalyst to make that happen? We never got into that, but it needed a catalyst, an institution that was simply focused on keeping these groups talking to one another and getting to know one another so that they wouldn't demonize each other.
Michael, Concordis owes so much to you, so much to your presence, so much to your writing, so much to your influence and so much to your leadership. And on our 20th birthday, as we celebrate our 20th birthday, it's just such a pleasure to be in conversation, just chatting with you. And I really, really appreciate that. What would be your big takeaway, your big piece of advice and counsel, word from the wise to us, not just as we celebrate our 20th birthday and look back, but actually look forward to where we want to go next?
I think the real question for Concordis is, where do you want to focus your effort? Because unless you grow hugely, you're going to have to prioritize. And also, that also raises the question about how do you decide which conflict area to focus on? Because there are so many conflict areas all over Central Africa, the south of the Sahel, and then the north of what's normally called sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, those areas are huge conflict zones and will continue to be so because of the environmental changes that are affecting them so much. So my question really is thrown back to you. How are you going to choose and prioritize those conflicts, and which ones you should give your time to, because you can't do them all?
Those are great questions. So as far as where we focus, one of the things that we have found is that having engaged with this Sudan and South Sudan borderland issue that came up about there's a new international border. How is that border actually going to function? And there's some economics there as well as some peace building work there. That sort of extended us across into Central African Republic, and then Chad, and then Cameroon, because actually these are all borders, very, very porous borders, through which people, goods and livestock continue to pass, and also naughtiness and nastiness and firearms and difficult ideologies are there. And of course, climate change is no respecter of any of those borders either. So actually engaging at that level is really interesting. So not just suddenly go, oh, it'd be interesting to go to Colombia. And to kind of keep that knowledge and expertise and experience. That's one part in terms of the geography. One of the things that we found is that actually they join up somehow. And that is that if we can work to help a border work well, and that's a border that is a long, long way, both politically and geographically from the capital, various capitals. Actually, sometimes you can get that border to work really, really well by bringing in some of the power brokers from both sides of the border. And so I guess that's where we call that sort of local as regional. So it's not to bypass the national, but it's local as regional. And so looking for regional solutions to some of these very complex challenges.
Absolutely.
Using the knowledge that you've been talking about the economics, about the research, presenting some solutions, having locally owned some. And then making sure that we don't leave the national governments behind. And encouraging them, perhaps working with them to encourage them to engage with that process as well. And so then that's where I think, to answer your question, if I may, I think that's where it moves from. It's both and. So there's both this person and this person have an argument, and blood has been shed. And we need to work out a way of resolving that before that escalates in some sort of horrendous Rwanda-style conflagration. And at the same time, we need to understand and then help people to address those root causes of the conflict, those structural drivers of the conflict. And sometimes a clever way of doing that has been to be working regionally. So that's the bit that excites us, gets us out of bed in the morning. And I think that's the bit that actually we draw on the legacy of all the stuff that we've been talking about. And then hopefully another couple of things that we've picked up over the last 20 years as well.
I would say so.
But that's where we're trying to sort of join those two up.
It's so encouraging, to see how the work from which I started in such a small way has simply grown and become so much more sophisticated and so much more thought through. And it's a great joy. Honestly, it is, Peter. It's fantastic.
Well, it's on the shoulders of giants.
No. But it's absolutely wonderful that we need so much. We need peace building experience and knowledge and expertise and experience. We need that in the world so much. I mean, we're moving into a world where conflict is more and more problematic and violent and resulting in misery in people's lives. And if you think forwards, then, given the nature of the global environment, physically, the environment, and also the fractious nature of the ideological battles and the battles between the megastates, China, Russia, US, and so on, Europe, you realize that the trajectory is likely to be growing difficulties and violence because, unfortunately, these global things impact on countries like in Africa, for example, which are highly dependent on external resources and other things, in a way which is kind of, I was going to say, exponential. I mean, it's exaggerated. So, and that's tragic. I mean, the Africans don't deserve that kind of conflict being imported from outside, but that's what's happening.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on how peace building has changed. Now we've got a much more sort of multifaceted set of power structures. The global environment moving from a sort of quite a binary position of the sort of the global powers to being a much more sort of multipolar world. And what does that do to peace building? Has peace building changed? Has the need for peace building changed?
I think it's partly that one's in more of a multipolar world, thinking about BRICS, for example, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, I think, is the fifth, but one could have Saudi Arabia in there too. But it is more of a multipolar world, although in terms of the global powers, it really does boil down, I think, largely to the US and Russia and China being the three big ones, but instead of two, there are now three, as the big players on the planet with their different ideological perspectives, although two are autocratic and one is not. But the environmental problems have really ramped up in a major way, and we're not really paying enough attention, in my mind, to things like the future of water, because I think water is one of the scarcest products on the planet. And if you look at, for example, how is Delhi receiving its water? Well, it's from the Ganges. Where does the Ganges get its water? From the Himalayas. How do the Himalayas produce water? And it's melting glaciers. And glaciers can't go on melting forever, because after they've melted, they've melted. And it's the same, of course, in Europe, that the glaciers are all melting in the Alps. So with a warming planet, water is going to become more and more of a critical problem. So that you can anticipate where conflicts are coming down the road from water. Now, we discussed earlier how important water was in the Sudan situation. Rwanda is taking out of what goes into Lake Victoria. So I think one can look forward and anticipate where conflicts are coming down the line, and also start thinking about, well, how do you preempt those conflicts? If I was recommending something to Concordis, I'd be saying, where can we see conflicts coming in the next 20, 30 years due to a variety of environmental factors? So it's partly a matter of looking at where is the population growth happening. Well, we're actually globally in population decline now, as you probably know, which is a help in some respects, but equally the availability of water is in even more sharp decline. So I think we can see some real problems on the horizon there.
I think one of the bits I take from that is that there's all these issues going on. So we've got a rise of a new set of global powers.
Yep.
And their involvement in the African context is some combination of malignant and benign. You've got the questions of climate change and the effects on water, but also extreme heat and flooding and all that kind of thing. So you've got those dynamics that are happening. And then you've also got new technology, social media, artificial intelligence, and they will have an impact on it. And I think one of the things that I take from this is that it comes back to what you were saying, that we need to be wise about all these things. We need to be well researched, well informed, and we need to make sure, we need to take on our responsibility to become well informed about all those things. And at the same time, I think we need to hold on to the old truths, which are relational proximity is absolutely essential. And we need to resist the temptation that some people have of saying, well, we can probably do peace building from, I don't know, a satellite, or we can do peace building by AI, or we can do peace building by social media. Now, there can be a role of peace building in those things, but ultimately what it's got to come down to is that relational connection with getting people in a room so that they can actually connect with each other, that they can have a relationship, so that actually they can sit down in a room together and smash out an agreement overnight that actually is acceptable to two of them because they are friends. And there, I think, there's nothing new under the sun. Notwithstanding all of these new challenges, which we need to be wise as serpents about, actually having that relational proximity is pretty solid.